President Biden is facing calls to drop his bid for re-election. That's after his debate performance against Donald Trump. Biden sat down for an exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos.
I'm the guy that put NATO together, the future. No one thought I could expand it. I'm the guy that shut Putin down. No one thought could happen. I'm the guy that put together the South Pacific Initiative with AUKUS. I'm the guy that got 50 nations, not only in Europe, outside of Europe as well, to help Ukraine. I'm the guy that got Japanese to expand their budget. I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me. Who's going to be able to hold NATO together like me? If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
Here now with their thoughts on President Biden's first interview since the debate are Bloomberg political contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino.
I think that what stood out to me in this interview with George Stephanopoulos was what an honorable person Joe Biden is. He went out of his way to compliment his staff, to try and sound above the fray, to play it fair, a distinctly different kind of interview than what you would have had if George Stephanopoulos was interviewing Donald Trump. In fact, I think it's almost his greatest vulnerability in a campaign, where even he described Donald Trump telling 28 lies in the course of the debate. But then we have to remember that Donald Trump technically won that debate, that he wasn't able to stand up to the person he loathes the most in American politics. So I think that this is a very telling interview, but I'm not sure it tells us anything more about whether or not Joe Biden can sustain an election campaign and a victory in November. The moment that really stood out for me was when Stephanopoulos asked Joe Biden repeatedly about his health and his cognitive state. He must have asked him 3 or 4 times in a row, have you taken a cognitive test? Have you been examined? And Joe Biden's response to that was simply, every day is a test for me. Every day I'm proving to people that I have this cognitive ability. The problem is that has not been the case for Joe Biden, even since the debate. He's had issues with responses to questions and speeches that he kind of bungled in certain places. And it's kind of added to the impression that he has cognitive issues. They weren't on display in this interview, but I'm not sure he quelled any concerns about them in the future. I think President Biden still has a significant hurdle to building confidence within his own party, within party leaders, and certainly with Democrat supporters or supporters of Joe Biden, because there are more questions that are being asked about him than he's really been willing to say in this interview in response. And even in last breaking news that George Stephanopoulos asked Joe Biden about this issue of Senator Mark Warner assembling senators in the Democratic Party to, who are concerned with his ability to prolong the campaign. And he basically stiffed him and said, well, Warner ran for president too and lost. It was a non-responsive argument. And then he went on to say that he's talked to the minority leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, and other leaders. But he has a problem that he is not recognizing or was unwilling to respond to tonight. There was no elixir for a Democratic voter or a Democratic leader to feel good about this interview. I think his biggest problem is still yet to come, is convincing his own party that he has the capacity to beat Trump.
This was a make or break night for Joe Biden in terms of trying to quell what has been so much discomfort amongst Democratic voters in particular, and people who really love Joe Biden and think that he did a very good job in his first term, but that the debate performance was so bad that really he needs to consider getting out of the race. And so when it comes to comparing how he did tonight versus the debate, he did far better. He was engaged. He was energetic. He was going back and forth with George Stephanopoulos. He was not using a monitor or a teleprompter, if you will. And so from that perspective, it was certainly a better performance than the debate. He also was himself in terms of saying all the problems that occurred during the debate were his and his alone. Nobody else was to blame. All of that said, his voice was still hoarse. He meandered a bit. It was unable, I think, or unwilling to face the reality of what we are hearing and what the American public and American Democratic voters are saying and the concerns that people are expressing. So from that perspective, I think he did better than the debate, but it still wasn't enough. The moment that I think really stood out for me, there were a couple. One was the fact that he said when asked that he would only stand down or get out of the race if the Lord tells him he needs to. And he said that a couple of times, and George Stephanopoulos repeated it. And for Democrats, the reality is about 6 or 7 out of 10 Democrats are saying they want something new. And so to hear the president say that he wouldn't consider getting out of the race unless the Lord told him he needed to suggests something else that really stood out in this interview, which was when George Stephanopoulos asked him, is he being selfish in terms of running? And that has been one of the big things that we wanted as Democrats, Joe Biden to do during the debate, that message we wanted him to send, which was that Donald Trump is all in this for himself. And he, Joe Biden, and as the leading Democrat, is here for the American public and to do what is right for the American public. He was unable to make that case during the debate. And now to hear him say tonight that despite the fact you have so much consternation amongst the American public, the only reason he would get out is if the Lord tells him he needs to, is a troubling message for him to be sending. Likewise, his argument that he hasn't heard people saying how dismal the debate was, but more importantly, the fact that the concerns they have about his health are real. And so when he was asked if he would take a cognitive test, when he was asked if he would share the results of a neurological exam with the American public, he dodged that repeatedly. And it seems to me at this point, if American people, Democrats in particular, but the American voter as a whole, are concerned about your health, you do have an obligation to ensure that you are not an enormous risk to all of us going forward. Whether Joe Biden has done enough to persuade those who are saying he shouldn't run for re-election, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination he has done enough tonight to do that, but I don't think he could have. This was an okay interview. It was far better than the debate, but the alarm bells going off amongst Democratic voters and the American public in particular are at such an alarming level that I'm not sure there's anything one debate could do. And I think the fact that one interview rather could do, and I think the fact that the interview was taped and not live is going to be troubling to some people. I think the fact that the interview was fairly brief, it was, 15 to 20 minutes, likewise troubling. But I think even more importantly is the fact that we are a week after the debate. These questions have been ongoing since the first 5 minutes of the debate, and why he didn't get out early and quick and tell the American public whatever he wanted to say about what had happened during the debate. All of those things, I think, make the idea that one interview could do enough to persuade people that he should run, I think, is not likely to happen. So from that perspective, I think it was an okay interview, but he's going to need a lot more and a lot better, quite frankly, in order to change any minds.
Jeanne, you mentioned that one of the things that Joe Biden refused to do in the interview is recognize that he needed to do more to prove his cognitive capability medically to the American people. And I remember in 2000 when John McCain first ran for president, there was a whisper campaign that, he'd been affected by his time in a Vietnamese prison camp. And we wound up going back and collecting every medical record that the military had on John McCain. And there were dozens and dozens of psych evaluations. And in those, he was able to show the American public that he had the capacity, but it was a made up issue that was not created by his performance, that was done politically, that we were able to show unequivocally his mental health. I don't think this is any different than that. You do have an obligation to show the American people that you have the capacity to govern, and he should be actually leaning in on that rather than fouling it off.
I agree with that. That's why I thought when George Stephanopoulos asked him about this issue, are you willing to take a cognitive neurological test? Have you? I was stunned to hear that he said, no one told me I should, initially. And then he just sort of pivoted and started talking about his record. It's as if he hasn't heard or understood the seriousness with which not just his debate performance, but what he has done in the week since, where he has made gaffe after gaffe, and what has preceded all of this. He's blaming that on the media, but the reality is this is a president who has not been talking to the press nearly as often. He has not done a live interview, a hard-hitting interview for long periods of times. His press conferences are few and far between. So the idea that he said nobody told him to, number one, and number two, that he would pivot to talking about his record. I think his record is strong. I think he has a lot to talk about there. But this is about the fact that from a perspective of his presentation last Thursday night, the American public have a right to ask, are you up to this job? And the fact that he is not, to your point, Rick, leaning in to say absolutely, and here are the records to prove it, that is stunning. And it is, quite frankly, political malpractice from my perspective. And, I think that is just going to prolong the agony of people like Mark Warner and others who are saying, we need to wrap our heads around this as Democrats and see what needs to happen here. And I just go back to the fact that you have about 3/4 of Americans, according to the last New York Times poll, saying he is too old for the job. So he needs to prove that he is up to this job mentally and physically at this point. Nobody else can do that. And if he can't do that, then Democrats have a right to look in another direction. And if he is not going to be open to that, that is going to be a problem for Democratic leaders and Democratic donors as Congress comes back next Monday.